Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to the Community Conversations with the UI Cancer Center. I'm Perrin Green Jr., and if you are joining us for the first time, Community Conversations is a weekly show hosted by the UI Health Cancer Center, where we highlight UI health and community partners, cancer information, and different cancer focused programs and interventions. Our aim built around the UIC Cancer Center's Bench to Community model is to disseminate educational health information to the community. Our guest today is Dr. Khan, Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine in Hematology and Oncology at the UI Cancer Center. Today, Dr. Khan is joining us to discuss clinical trials and diversity in clinical trials. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Khan.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a real honor to be here and to represent the Cancer Center on the show.
Definitely. So we want to go and have a conversation today. So one of the first questions we want to ask is, could you please just give us an overview of what clinical trials are?
Yeah. When we talk about clinical trials, there are a number of possibilities to approach it. So when we talk about clinical trials, traditionally you think of interventional trials where patients are actually getting treatment, and and that's what I'm going to focus largely on. So within therapeutic trials, you can have early phase trials, which are phase 1 and 2 trials, where the drugs are still early in their development and are being studied mainly for safety and then also efficacy in specific diseases. They can be drugs that are entirely new or drugs that have been studied for other diseases and are being studied for the first time in a particular cancer of interest. And then phase 3 trials are slightly more mature trials, which are usually trying to test a drug against the standard of care, which may be another drug, it may be observation. That's once a drug proves its efficacy in a phase 3 trial, that's usually the stepping stone for approval frequently.
Okay.
Clinical trials essentially allow drugs to move quickly to where they are available to the public once they get FDA approval. So they're a very important way for us to help science to move compounds from the lab into public domain where patients can have access to them, especially in diseases where we really need new treatments.
Definitely. And you said something real key. You said FDA. Can you let us know what FDA means?
Yes, sorry. So the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. So this is a federal governing body that reviews all research that is being done with any experimental compound, and even as I said, if it's a drug that's approved in another disease and you're studying it for the first time in a new disease to explore its effectiveness, that also comes under their review. And before a drug is approved for use in any disease, the FDA reviews all the research that was done and all the data. So it's a very carefully scrutinized work that is done.
Definitely. And so our next question is, can you tell us a little bit about your role at the Cancer Center?
So I am a clinician. My area of I work in hematology oncology, so I'm an oncologist. I focus on blood cancers, and I take care of patients that have leukemia, both acute and chronic. So I work with patients from the time of diagnosis through their treatment, and that treatment can involve treatment in clinic, outpatient care, as well as inpatient care, as a lot of drugs sometimes have to be given in the hospital. So treating patients, and that treatment can entail standard therapy, which is frequently chemotherapy or novel drugs. But it also, a large part of what we do is try and screen patients to see if they're eligible for any of the novel therapies. At being a university center, we do have access to a lot of these experimental compounds that are not widely available, and sometimes present a unique opportunity for patients to benefit from a new drug that they may not have access to otherwise. So we're always screening patients when we see them and thinking about what we can do to add to the standard of care and try and better the outcome as we see them, whether it's in the front line of treatment or after a few lines of treatment when the options start becoming limited, then these new drugs are often a very important avenue for our patients to continue therapy.
Definitely, thank you. Once again, this is the UI Health Community Conversations. We're here with Dr. Khan, Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine and Hematology and Oncology. We are discussing diversity in clinical trials and clinical trials overall. If you have any questions for Dr. Khan, please feel free to give us a call at 312-738-1060. That's 312-738-1060. And also, can you tell us what sort of trials does USC currently have?
So UIC currently has both investigational trials where investigators are looking both at clinical research questions, and those may range from looking at behavioral patterns, behavioral interventions. So these are observational studies frequently, sometimes they're interventional studies. They can be retrospective, where you're going back and looking at charts and looking for trends or patterns that can possibly influence an interventional trial. There are also interventional trials, which, as I said, can be range from behavioral trials to actual therapeutic interventions. Therapeutic interventions would be the use of a new drug, either on its own or in combination with existing therapy, or sometimes being compared up front, where you get randomized to either the standard of care or the new agent. So there are a range of trials ongoing. And one of the things that I think it's important to highlight is that we recently did a study on a group of diseases that's somewhat rare called the myeloproliferative neoplasms. It's a kind of a chronic white blood cell leukemia. And because at the University of Illinois, Chicago, we have a fair amount of representation from different ethnic groups of patients, we were able to, for the first time, even ask the question as to whether ethnicity plays a role in how the disease does. So this was not an interventional trial. We were just retrospectively looking at a group of patients that had the same disease and seeing that if you are African American or if you're Asian or if you're Caucasian, is your disease different? And so this is some of the really interesting questions that can be answered with clinical research. And so what we found was actually interesting, and it was a question that had never been asked, and we found that there are, in fact, big differences in disease outcomes in patients depending on their ethnic background. Certain complications are more in Caucasians, whereas others are more in African Americans. And that's important because as a physician, then that would allow you to know what things to watch for in your patient, tailored a little bit more to that patient based on their ethnic subgroup. So that's some of sort of the insight you can get with clinical research, provided you have an array of different patients to look at.
Definitely. And one clinical trial that is actually going on at USC that we discussed on the show before is actually the ENACT trial,
Yes.
which is engaging newly diagnosed men about cancer treatment options. And the research is being done to better understand how a new lab test may impact what treatment men decide to get and how they feel about their choice of treatment. So there are a variety of clinical trials going on at at the University of Illinois at Chicago with the UI Health Center. And one thing in the previous comment you touched on was the ethnicity and the race and things like that. And outside of talking about clinical overview of clinical trials, we do want to discuss diversity in clinical trials.
Yeah.
So why is diversity so important in clinical trials?
So I think more and more we are realizing that, especially with the explosion of technology available to us in DNA sequencing and understanding genomic subsets of disease, at the same time we're understanding that individuals are very different, and trying to break up what was once considered an umbrella disease into different subgroups to better tailor treatment to patients is kind of the thrust of the whole precision medicine initiative. And I think in the same way as we are trying to precisely define the disease, we're also trying to precisely define the patient, because we know, for example, that there are polymorphisms, which is basically differences in the DNA that we are born with that can determine how we metabolize drugs, for example. And the same drug that works in one group of patients may not work as well in another group of patients. And frequently these, what they're called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, are preserved in ethnic and racial subgroups because they're in the gene pool. So it's only by observing differences in patients, for example, kind of going back to the study that we were involved in, where we noticed that African American patients with a myeloproliferative neoplasm are more likely to have blood clots than a Caucasian patient with the exact same disease. So that would beget the next question, which is that are there genetic reasons for that? Do these patients have nuclear polymorphisms that we can identify and look at their blood, for example, and really pick out that, okay, this is why these patients are having more clots, and this is something that we can intervene on or screen for down the road to prevent this complication now that we know about it. So this kind of information is unfortunately only with numbers can we actually prove things like this. So that's why the more diversity we have in clinical trials, the more we're able to tease out, number one, observe differences in outcomes across ethnic groups, and then also looking at those samples and going back and seeing that why was it that this group responded better, and is it related to ethnicity. So that's why it's important to have a good representation, and that's one of the big challenges in clinical research, is that frequently minority subgroups are underrepresented, and we're missing out on this valuable opportunity to learn more about disease in these patients, which in turn would allow us to better tailor treatment to these subgroups.
Definitely. And while we're discussing diversity in clinical trials, are there any creative or innovative ways that you feel like we should reach out to minority groups to get them more involved in clinical trials, or is that something innovative that you and your colleagues are doing to really get minorities involved in clinical trials?
Well, so one of the things that I was fortunate to be part of and represent the University of Illinois in was an initiative by the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which is a group that works towards hosting a lot of events for patients, patient education, various patient advocacy forums. And so for the first time, they began this event where they're directing the education events to specific ethnic subgroups. And so we did a conference on myeloma in African American patients, and it was really very rewarding to be part of the first conference of this kind, which is really tailored to a subset of patients that we really want to draw into clinical research and clinical trials, and be able to talk about at least some early results that we have in our patients, where we can see that there are differences in myeloma in African Americans versus Caucasians and how they respond to treatment, and kind of present this to a patient audience. So I think that was a good initiative and really well received, because we had a lot of our patients represented as well as patients from other institutions in Chicago. We tried to have faculty represented across the city. And it was really nice to see patients and their families and friends coming and asking questions, and really interested in seeing that the disease does differ based on your ethnic background. And so it's important to have every group well represented in a clinical trial, so that we're not concluding things across the board when a patient subgroup was totally not represented in the original trial that was done.
Definitely. Once again, you are watching the UI Health Cancer Center Community Conversations. We are speaking with Dr. Khan about diversity in clinical trials and giving an overview of clinical trials. Please feel free to join the conversation. We are taking calls at 312-738-1060, 312-738-1060. And I know we were talking about a lot of community engagement in clinical trials. Are there any partnerships that your office or even the university has with the community in terms of even recruiting minorities to clinical trials?
Well, I think the main, as a physician, the main resources I refer my patients, especially when patients are newly diagnosed, it can be a lot of information coming at them, often life-altering. So I like to refer them to other educational resources, which include information about clinical trials, and because my area of interest is blood cancer, so for me the two forums that and societies that I encourage my patients to get involved with very quickly, and their family members, are the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, as I mentioned, and also the Leukemia Research Foundation. These are both great groups that publish a lot of education material for patients, and they also have always up-to-date information on the clinical trials ongoing in any particular area, and more importantly, patient support groups, which again help patients a lot, hearing about other patients who are on clinical trials and what their experience was, because there is some amount of reservation about clinical trials, and I think it's, in addition to hearing about it from your physician, it's also nice to hear about it from other patients. So I always encourage my patients to go to all of these forums where, in addition to your own physician, there's physicians represented across institutions and patients from everywhere. So it's a good opportunity to get your questions answered in a very unbiased way and get several perspectives. And this is the blood cancer forums that I'm talking about, but there are similar forums for every tumor. So.
Okay, thanks. And I know we talked about this a lot during the show, but what is the best way people can engage with clinical trials?
I think probably the first point of reference for most people is their physician. So just asking the question about, what are my options as a clinical trial? Because again, I think oftentimes, our interaction with a patient with a new diagnosis is a time when we're trying to convey a lot of information to a patient, and everybody is coming at it from a slightly different place. And so if you've had a chance to look this up or have even heard about the idea, then if you are the patient yourself or a family member who's with a patient, I think it's important to just bring up the question, because sometimes, we also want to break things in stepwise, and so sometimes clinical trials is sort of the end of the conversation, but if a patient brings it up front, then you can sort of spend a little more time talking about it and get engaged in it. But I think the patient asking the question or a family member is always a very good way to immediately kind of zone in on that question. And again, as I said, that not all clinical trials are necessarily treatment interventions. There are some, but there are others where it's simple data gathering or a behavioral intervention, or as I said, data collection from just from your chart. So any of these are opportunities for you to contribute to the general body of information, and also potentially benefit from new therapies or ways to approach treatment.
Definitely, thank you. And we also have a couple short videos that we also like to show from the Food and Drug Administration. They actually have a campaign where they are encouraging people to, become involved in clinical trials, to be a champion for clinical trials. So we actually want to show a couple of those videos.
I'm Shirley Miller, and I have sickle cell disease. I want to encourage you to participate in a clinical trial. Clinical trials are not just for people who have a medical condition. Healthy volunteers are needed too. You should know that your safety is the #1 priority. There are strict guidelines that have to be followed to protect you.
Sorry.
Your personal information is safeguarded at all times.
Oh,
You can leave this study at any time.
I'm going to try to show another video.
For more information, visit clinicaltrials.gov. I'm Shirley Miller.
All right. Okay, and also another resource is I'm in, as well as clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov. Um, and once again, this is the UI Health Cancer Center Community Conversations. We are talking with Dr. Khan about diversity in clinical trials. Please feel free to call in at 312-738-1060. That is 312-738-1060. And so the main thing we've been talking about are clinical trials in terms of the best method, research studies and best methods and strategies to treat certain illnesses, and how they can be effective. We also discussed the best way people can actually engage with clinical trials is actually talking to their primary care provider. And if you don't have a primary care provider, definitely please feel free to contact the UI Cancer Center. Definitely look at our website, cancer.uillinois.edu. We are connected with Mile Square, which is a fairly qualified health center, and we can assist people with connecting them with primary care providers for primary care, as well as assisting again getting them engaged in clinical trials as well. And also, if anyone is interested in clinical trials or has any questions, is there a way they can, best way to contact you or your office or?
Yes, absolutely. We have a clinical trials office, and I can provide my email or phone number. So my name is Iram Khan, IRUM, last name Khan, KHAN, and my email address is iramkhan@uic.edu, and my office number is 312-996-1581. So you can call me anytime, and if it's not my area of expertise, I'm happy to find the right person and help you get plugged in, because we have a large clinical trials office and a number of ongoing trials, so we're happy to tailor the right trial for a particular patient.
Definitely. And the university has a variety of different clinical trials going on, so even if they contact you and they may not have, and your office doesn't have a trial that is actually working on what they're interested in, then they can definitely, you guys can definitely assist or connect them with other offices or people that may have different trials going on.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm currently treating a patient who we did not have the correct trial for that I felt was right for this particular patient, and so I worked with other institutions in the area, and we're trying to hopefully have them on a clinical trial at another institution that I think will better serve them. So I think working to find the right trial for a patient is very important, and we will do whatever is needed to get you to the right therapy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we would definitely like to thank Dr. Khan, who is the Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine and Hematology and Oncology at the UI Cancer Center, for joining us today. Also, we have our contact information if there are any follow-up questions that you may have for the Cancer Center. Definitely please feel free to give us a call, and also check out our website at cancer.uillinois.edu, and we definitely like to thank you for joining us.